What's up, everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. Trump just posted, in his own words, that the U.S. military is locked and loaded and ready to unleash levels of military terror, strength, and power, not seen since World War II. And then, hours later, he called the whole thing off. Let's break down exactly what just happened, why he pulled back at the last second, and what a stretched, strained U.S. military readiness picture tells you about how sustainable this entire posture actually is. I'll walk through Trump's actual statement and the cancellation that followed it, then the Saudi phone call that appears to have played a real role in that decision, then the genuinely concerning readiness numbers on America's own interceptor stockpiles, then the broader military strain across other theaters, and finish with my take on what locked and loaded actually means when the trigger keeps not getting pulled. In a Truth Social post, Trump said the U.S. military was locked and loaded and ready to unleash levels of military terror, strength, and power not seen since World War II. That's about as maximal as rhetoric gets in this entire war. But late Saturday evening, he announced he was canceling the planned strikes, citing progress in talks with Tehran and other Middle Eastern capitals. CNN reported he'd held a call with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who reportedly raised concerns directly with Trump about plans for potential strikes. Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute offered a blunt read on why that Saudi pressure mattered, saying the Saudis don't have confidence the U.S. actually has a winning military strategy here. That's a genuinely striking assessment coming from a close U.S. partner who's absorbed real damage throughout this war and has every reason to want Iran's threat neutralized, yet is apparently unconvinced that more American strikes actually gets there. Here's the number that I think explains a lot about why Trump ultimately pulled back. The Center for Strategic and International Studies found that persistent combat operations have significantly reduced America's own missile interceptor inventory. Patriot interceptors are now under 1,000, and THAAD interceptors are down to roughly 250. Those aren't abstract numbers, those are the actual physical systems protecting U.S. bases and allied cities from exactly the kind of Iranian missile fire I broke down in my last video. Every night of sustained strikes and counterstrikes draws down that inventory further, and there's no quick way to replace it. Parsi's other comment cuts right to the strategic bind Trump is actually in. Trump does not have an escalatory way out of this conflict. Iran has repeatedly demonstrated the ability to keep fighting back every single time the U.S. ramps up pressure, and could very plausibly do so again if this latest round of strikes had actually gone forward. The military is stretched thin everywhere, not just here. I also want to bring in something from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that adds real context to this decision. Marine Corps Commandant General Eric Smith has publicly acknowledged Iran operations have left a genuine capability gap in the Indo-Pacific. Moving carriers, strike groups, and other major assets between theaters takes time and resources. And with the U.S. simultaneously running operations in Venezuela, ongoing boat strikes in the Caribbean, and talk of a Cuba operation on top of this Iran war, the joint force is genuinely being stretched across multiple theaters at once. That same analysis noted second and third order effects are already showing up elsewhere, including delayed weapons deliveries to European allies. That's the honest picture behind the bold rhetoric, locked and loaded. Sounds like unlimited capability, but the actual readiness data suggests something closer to a military managing real, cumulative strain across every front it's currently committed to. I think this cancellation tells you more about where this war actually stands than the locked and loaded post did. Threatening WW2 level force is cheap, rhetorically. Actually pulling that trigger, with Patriot stocks under 1,000, THAAD under 250, allies like Saudi Arabia openly questioning the strategy, and the broader force already stretched across multiple global theaters, is a genuinely different calculation. I think Trump's own hesitation here, spending real-time thinking about this decision according to sources, reflects an accurate read of just how costly another major escalation would actually be right now, regardless of how the public rhetoric sounds. I want to unpack that specific phrase for a second because, as a former fighter pilot, language like that isn't just colorful rhetoric to me. It describes an actual operational state. Locked and loaded means munitions are physically mounted on delivery platforms, targeting solutions are prepared, and the only remaining step is the execution order. When a president uses that language publicly, it's not simply a threat. It's effectively a public confirmation that specific military assets have already been positioned and ready to execute a strike on very short notice. That's a genuinely different category of statement than saying we're considering military options or everything is on the table, language we've heard throughout this entire war. This was a statement asserting the actual mechanics of readiness were already in place. That's exactly why the walkback matters so much. Canceling an operation after publicly declaring that level of readiness carries real costs beyond the immediate tactical situation. It signals to Iran, to allies, and to domestic political audiences that the threshold for actually pulling the trigger is higher than the rhetoric alone would suggest, and it gives Iran's own negotiators real evidence that American red lines can be tested and walked back from, at least under the right combination of diplomatic movement and allied pressure. I think that's worth sitting with, because it's the kind of dynamic that tends to repeat itself, and it lines up with a pattern I've now tracked across dozens of videos on this war. Deadlines and thresholds get set publicly and then get quietly extended or walked back when the actual cost-benefit calculation gets weighed in the room. I want to spend more time on the Mohammed bin Salman phone call specifically, because I think it's actually the single most consequential detail in this entire update, more than the locked and loaded language itself. Saudi Arabia has been a genuine combat participant throughout large stretches of this war, joining U.S. strikes against Iran-backed militias in Iraq, absorbing real casualties and infrastructure damage from Iranian retaliation, and generally standing as one of Washington's most reliably aligned partners throughout this entire conflict. For the Crown Prince to personally intervene, directly raising concerns with Trump about a specific imminent strike package, represents a genuinely significant use of political capital from an ally who's had every reason throughout this war to want Iran's capabilities degraded as thoroughly and as quickly as possible. That tells you the Saudi assessment of this specific strike package wasn't rooted in general war weariness or a desire to protect Iran. It was almost certainly rooted in a much more specific concern that Gulf states like Saudi Arabia itself would bear the brunt of Iranian retaliation if this particular round of strikes went forward, without a clear sense that the strikes themselves would actually achieve a decisive war-ending result. Trina Parsi's comment about the Saudis lacking confidence in whether the U.S. has a winning military strategy captures that concern precisely. This isn't an ally asking the U.S. to stop fighting Iran altogether. It's an ally questioning whether this specific escalation was likely to produce results proportionate to the retaliatory risk it would create for countries like Saudi Arabia sitting in Iran's immediate missile range. I mentioned the Patriot and THAAD figures earlier, but I want to explain why those specific numbers, under 1,000 Patriot interceptors and roughly 250 THAAD interceptors, are genuinely alarming rather than just abstractly concerning. These aren't systems the U.S. produces quickly or cheaply. THAAD, interceptors in particular, are exquisite, expensive, technologically sophisticated munitions with production timelines measured in months to years, not weeks. And the manufacturing base supporting them isn't built for rapid wartime surge production the way some other munitions categories are. Patriot interceptors are somewhat more numerous in the broader global inventory, but sustained combat operations across multiple theaters, this Iran war, continued support commitments to Ukraine and other allies, and now additional operations in the Western Hemisphere that I mentioned earlier, all draw from the same finite production pipeline. When CSIS specifically flags that persistent combat operations have reduced these inventories to these specific levels, that's effectively a warning about the actual ceiling on how much longer the current defensive posture across Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Israel can be sustained at the current operational tempo, without either a significant production surge or a reduction in the rate interceptors are being expended. Given that I've documented in my other videos just how frequently these systems have been engaging incoming Iranian fire, dozens of intercepts and single engagements at various points throughout this war, that inventory pressure isn't a theoretical concern. It's an active constraint shaping real decisions happening right now, including, quite possibly, this specific decision to cancel the planned strikes Trump had just publicly announced were locked and loaded. I touched on this briefly, but I think it deserves much more attention than a single paragraph, because I think it's actually the underlying structural story explaining almost every hesitation and walkback we've seen from the administration throughout the second half of this war. General Eric Smith's acknowledgement of an Indo-Pacific capability gap isn't a minor administrative note. The Indo-Pacific theater represents the primary area of long-term strategic competition with China, and any sustained gap in U.S. capability there carries consequences that could persist long after this Iran war eventually ends, regardless of how that resolution actually looks. Layer on top of that, the Venezuela operation, the ongoing Caribbean boat strikes, and reported consideration of a Cuba operation, and you get a genuinely comprehensive picture of a military simultaneously committed across an unusually wide range of simultaneous operations for a single administration to be running at once. That Chicago Council analysis made an important point I think deserves to be repeated directly. Readiness hits are cumulative while trade-offs are immediate, meaning every individual operational decision, moving a carrier strike group, expending an interceptor, redeploying a squadron, produces an immediate tactical benefit in whatever theater it's directed toward, while the broader readiness cost of having made that decision compounds silently in the background, showing up later as exactly the kind of gaps and delays being reported now: delayed weapons deliveries to European allies, reduced Indo-Pacific presence, and apparently, at least in part, this specific decision to pull back from a strike package that had already been publicly announced as ready to execute. I want to close this expanded section by connecting this specific incident to the broader pattern I've now documented across dozens of videos throughout this entire war. Nearly every major deadline, threat, or declared point of no return in this conflict, the ceasefire deadlines, the infrastructure targeting threats, the assassination response threats, and now this locked and loaded declaration, has eventually either been walked back, extended, or executed in a smaller, more limited form than the original rhetoric suggested. That's not necessarily evidence of weakness or bluffing. It's consistent with exactly the kind of constrained decision-making you'd expect from an administration managing genuine resource limitations, alliance management pressures, and multi-theater strategic commitments simultaneously, the kind of pressures I've just walked through in detail in this expanded section. I think that pattern is actually the most important thing. For anyone following this war to understand at this point, the gap between the rhetoric coming out of Washington and the actual operational decisions that follow it has been consistently wide throughout this entire conflict, and understanding why that gap exists, munitions constraints, allied pressure, multi-theater strain, tells you far more about where this war is actually headed than any single dramatic Truth Social post ever could on its own. I also want to spend some time on the specific historical comparison Trump reached for in that Truth Social post, because invoking World War II level military terror is about as extreme a rhetorical benchmark as exists in the American political vocabulary. World War II remains the single most destructive conflict in human history, and the strategic bombing campaigns, specifically associated with that war, the firebombing of Japanese and German cities, represent a scale of destruction that virtually no military planner in the modern era actually intends to replicate against a country of Iran's size and population, given both the humanitarian catastrophe that would represent and the near-certain international backlash that would follow any genuine attempt to wage war at that historical scale. That gap between the rhetorical benchmark and any realistic military plan is worth sitting with. I don't think this specific comparison was meant as a literal operational description of what was actually loaded onto aircraft and ready to launch. It reads much more like maximal deterrent messaging, an attempt to communicate the broadest possible scope of potential consequences to Iran's leadership without actually committing to execute anything close to that scale. But rhetoric like this carries real risk precisely because of how it can be received and interpreted on the other side. If Iran's leadership took that specific comparison literally, even briefly, that's exactly the kind of language that could accelerate defensive or preemptive decision-making on their end, based on a threat that, as this cancellation demonstrates, was likely never actually going to be carried out anywhere near that scale in the first place. I think it's worth placing this specific incident into the broader historical pattern of nuclear era and modern brinkmanship more generally, because publicly declaring maximum readiness and then pulling back at the last moment in response to Allied pressure or last-minute diplomatic movement is a recognizable pattern that's played out in various forms across decades of American foreign policy, not something unique to this specific war or this specific administration. The core strategic logic behind that kind of public maximalist posturing, followed by a private, more measured pullback, is that it preserves deterrent value. Iran and other adversaries still have to take the stated threshold seriously going forward, even after this specific instance of it not being carried out, because the underlying capability to execute it clearly does exist. It just wasn't used this particular time. The risk in relying on that pattern repeatedly, though, is exactly the credibility erosion I flagged earlier. Deterrence works best when threats are actually followed through on with reasonable consistency, and every additional instance of a maximalist threat getting publicly walked back, for whatever legitimate underlying reason, chips away a little more at how seriously the next threat gets taken by the country on the receiving end. I've now documented multiple instances of exactly this pattern across this entire war: ceasefire deadlines that moved, infrastructure threats that got only partially carried out, and now this locked and loaded declaration followed by cancellation. At some point, and I genuinely don't know exactly where that point sits, that repeated pattern risks teaching Iran's leadership that American public threats in this conflict carry less operational certainty than the rhetoric alone would suggest, which is precisely the kind of dynamic that could end up requiring an even larger, more costly demonstration down the road, specifically to reestablish credibility that's been gradually eroded by this exact cycle repeating itself. I also want to think through how this specific sequence, maximal threat followed by cancellation, probably lands with the various audiences actually watching it closely. Energy markets, which I've tracked at various points throughout this entire series in terms of oil price reactions to escalation and de-escalation, tend to price in genuine uncertainty around moments like this one, A credible threat of WW-level strikes against Iran would represent a massive supply shock risk, given everything I've covered about Iran's role in regional oil infrastructure and the Strait of Hormuz specifically. So the swing from that maximal threat to an actual cancellation within the same news cycle likely produced real volatility in how traders were pricing risk in the hours between that Truth Social post and the follow-up cancellation announcement. For Gulf allies, specifically, beyond just Saudi Arabia's direct role in prompting this decision, I think this sequence probably reinforces something I've flagged in several of my other videos, that these countries are increasingly positioning themselves as active participants in shaping U.S. decision-making around this war, rather than simply absorbing whatever decisions Washington makes and dealing with the consequences afterward. A direct call from the Saudi Crown Prince actually changing the outcome of a major American military decision is a meaningful data point about how much leverage Gulf partners have accumulated over the course of this war. Likely a direct function of how much retaliatory exposure they've each personally absorbed throughout this conflict. The strikes on Qatar, the attacks on Kuwait, the missiles intercepted over Bahrain and Jordan that I've covered extensively across this entire series. That accumulated shared risk appears to be translating into real, tangible influence over how the war's next chapter actually gets written, which is a genuinely important dynamic to watch going forward, separate entirely from the pure military and readiness questions I've spent most of this video walking through. So that's where this stands, maximal rhetoric followed by a real last-minute cancellation, driven by Saudi pressure and a genuinely strained interceptor and readiness picture across the entire U.S. joint force, all sitting against the backdrop of a military simultaneously committed to operations in the Indo-Pacific, Venezuela, the Caribbean, and potentially Cuba. I'll keep tracking whether this pause holds or breaks like the last one did, and whether the underlying readiness pressures I've laid out here in detail continue shaping how far this administration is actually willing to go the next time rhetoric like this gets deployed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe for the next update. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.